She looked him dead in the eye and said, "Please, don't. You'll make it worse." And she meant it, because every time someone had tried to help before, she paid the price when she got home. So she learned to stop asking. She learned to cover the marks, fake the smile, and survive one shift at a time. But this man, this scarred, road-worn, Hell's Angel with a reputation that preceded him by miles, he didn't listen. Not because he didn't care what she wanted, but because he'd seen those same bruises before, on someone he couldn't save. And he swore, never again. Before we get into this story, I want to know something. Where are you watching from right now? Are you up late when the rest of the house is asleep? Are you on your lunch break? Are you driving down some long highway with this playing through your speakers? Drop your city, your state, your country in the comments. Because this story right here, it's reaching people everywhere, and I think that matters. I think it matters that a story about a waitress in a small southern diner and a biker who refused to look away is being heard by someone in Texas, and someone in London, and someone in a town so small it doesn't even show up on Google Maps. So tell me where you're listening from. Let me see how far this reaches. Because the further it goes, the more people hear it. And trust me, by the end of this one, you're going to want other people to hear it too. Now settle in. Get comfortable. Because this story is not a short one, and it is not a simple one. It's got a waitress who learned how to smile through things no person should ever have to smile through. It's got a man in a leather vest who the whole world told you to be afraid of, until he turned out to be the only one paying attention. It's got a villain who coached Little League and shook hands at church and fooled an entire town into thinking he was someone worth trusting. And it's got a moment, one single, quiet moment over a plate of cornbread in a roadside diner, that set off a chain of events nobody in that town saw coming. This is the story of a waitress who had been hiding her bruises until a Hell's Angel noticed. And what happened next changed her story forever. Let's begin. She looked him dead in the eye and said, "Please, don't. You'll make it worse." And she meant it, because every time someone had tried to help before, she paid the price when she got home. So she learned to stop asking. She learned to cover the marks, fake the smile, and survive one shift at a time. But this man, this scarred, road-worn, Hell's Angel with a reputation that preceded him by miles, he didn't listen. Not because he didn't care what she wanted, but because he'd seen those same bruises before, on someone he couldn't save. And he swore, never again. But before we get to him, we need to talk about her. We need to talk about the diner. And we need to talk about a small town called Cedar Mill, somewhere deep in the American South, where the summers are long, the gossip is longer, and the one thing people do better than anything else is look the other way. There was a place in Cedar Mill called the Dusty Spoon. Now, if you've ever driven through small-town America, really driven through, not just passed by on the interstate, you've seen a place like this. A little diner tucked between a hardware store and a barber shop that's only open 3 days a week. The kind of place where the coffee is always burnt, the pie is always fresh, and the bell above the door has been ringing the same tired little note since 1970-something. That was the Dusty Spoon. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't trying to be. It was just there. The way a kitchen table is there. The way a porch light is there. Steady. Familiar. The kind of place that doesn't change because the people inside it don't want it to. And behind the counter of that diner, 6 days a week, was a woman named Jolene Whitfield, 34 years old. She'd been working at the Dusty Spoon for 6 years, and in that time, she had become the place itself. The regulars didn't come for the meatloaf, though it was good. They didn't come for the coffee, though it was hot. They came because Jolene remembered. She remembered that Earl Dunning liked his eggs over medium, not over easy, and that he'd get real quiet if you got it wrong. She remembered that the Presley twins always split a chocolate shake but needed 2 cherries or there'd be a war. She remembered birthdays, anniversaries, bad knees, dead dogs, and the names of grandchildren she'd never met. She made people feel known. And in a town like Cedar Mill, where folks spent most of their lives just trying to get through the day, being known was no small thing. But lately, something had shifted. Jolene was still there every morning at 5:45, tying her apron, starting the coffee, flipping the sign from closed to open. She still smiled. She still remembered. But there was something behind the smile that hadn't been there before. A weight, a slowness in her eyes, like a person who hadn't been sleeping enough, or maybe had been sleeping too much just to avoid being awake. Her boss, Hank Bellwether, a thick-armed, silver-haired man who'd inherited the diner from his daddy and his daddy before that, noticed it in his own way. He noticed she flinched when the kitchen door slammed. He noticed she wore long sleeves in the middle of July. He noticed she stopped humming while she worked. But Hank was 71 years old, and he came from a generation of men who believed that what happened inside someone else's house was none of your business. So he didn't ask. He just poured himself another cup of coffee and told himself she was probably just tired. And maybe that was true. Maybe she was just tired. Because Jolene gave everything she had to everyone who walked through that door, and she kept nothing, not one single thing, for herself, except one, taped to the wall behind the kitchen pass, half hidden behind a grease-stained calendar, was a crayon drawing. Purple sky, green grass, two stick figures holding hands. At the bottom, in wobbly 6-year-old letters, it read, "Me and Mommy." Jolene's daughter, B, short for Beatrice, had drawn it on her first day of kindergarten, and Jolene had carried it in her apron pocket for a week before finally taping it up where she could see it every shift. She never talked about it. She never pointed it out. But every now and then, when the diner was loud and her hands were full and the world felt like it was pressing down on her from every direction, she'd glance at that drawing. Just for a second. Just long enough to remember why she kept showing up. Now, if this were a movie, someone would have noticed sooner. Someone would have seen the signs, connected the dots, and stepped in before things got worse. But real life doesn't work that way. In real life, people see exactly what they're comfortable seeing. And bruises? Bruises are uncomfortable. So people look at the smile instead. They take the excuse. They tell themselves it's not their place. And the person who needs help the most becomes the person no one is helping at all. That was Jolene Whitfield in the summer of 2019. Pouring coffee, remembering orders, hiding everything that mattered behind a ponytail and an apron and a smile she had to rebuild from scratch every single morning. And she might have kept hiding it forever, if it hadn't been for what walked through that door on a rainy Thursday night. Now, to understand what Jolene was hiding, you have to understand the man she was hiding it from. And this is where the story gets harder to tell. Because the truth about men like Wade Purcell is that they don't look like what you'd expect. They don't walk around with clenched fists and a scowl. They don't scare people in grocery store aisles. In fact, most of the time, they do the opposite. They charm. They disarm. They make you feel like you're the only person in the room worth talking to. And that's exactly what makes them so dangerous. Wade Purcell was 37 years old, good-looking in that effortless small-town way. Strong jaw, easy grin, the kind of laugh that made other people laugh even when the joke wasn't funny. He worked at the lumber yard on Route 9, and he was good at his job. Showed up on time. Helped the new guys without being asked. On Sundays, he volunteered at the Cedar Mill Baptist Church pancake breakfast, flipping short stacks and shaking hands and calling every woman over 60 ma'am, with a warmth that made them blush. In the spring, he coached Little League, not because he had a kid on the team, but because, as he liked to tell people, he believed in giving back to the community. People liked Wade. People trusted Wade. And if you had stopped any 5 residents of Cedar Mill on the street and asked them to describe him, at least 4 of them would have said the same thing. Good man. Real good man. But that was the version of Wade Purcell that existed between the front door and the rest of the world. The version that existed behind that front door, after the deadbolt turned and the curtains closed and there was no one left to perform for. That was a different man entirely. It didn't start with hitting. It never does. It started with words. Small ones at first, the kind you almost don't notice. You're wearing that. You really think that's funny? I just think you'd look better if. Little cuts disguised as concern. Little corrections that sounded, if you weren't paying attention, almost like love. Then the words got sharper. Then they got louder. Then they came with rules. Don't talk to other men at the diner. Don't stay late after your shift. Don't make him ask twice. Don't question him in front of other people. Don't bring up money. Don't cry. It makes you manipulative. Don't leave the house without telling him where you're going. Don't forget to answer your phone on the first ring. And above all, above everything, don't ever, ever make him look bad. The bruises came after the rules. And by the time they did, Jolene had already been so hollowed out by the words, so stripped of her own confidence and her own voice, that the bruises almost felt like a natural next step. Like she'd been walking down a staircase in the dark, and the bottom just finally arrived. A grabbed arm, a shove into a doorframe, an open hand across the side of her face on a Tuesday night because dinner was too cold, or too hot, or too late, or too something. It didn't matter. The reason was never the reason. The reason was control. And Wade had it. All of it. Jolene tried to leave once. 2 years before our story begins, she packed a bag in the middle of the night while Wade was passed out on the couch, loaded B into the back seat of her car, and drove 3 towns over to her older sister Maureen's house. Maureen opened the door at 2 in the morning, took one look at Jolene's face, and didn't say a word. She just stepped aside and let her in. For 12 hours, Jolene breathed. For 12 hours, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, safe. Then Wade showed up, flowers in one hand, tears on his face, a voice so soft and so broken that you'd swear you were looking at a man who had lost everything and knew it was his own fault. He stood on Maureen's porch, and he said all the things he knew how to say. He'd change. He'd get help. He couldn't live without her. He'd die without her. Please, please come home. Maureen stood in the hallway and said, "Don't you dare." Jolene went back anyway. She loaded B into the car seat, pulled out of the driveway, and watched her sister's face in the rearview mirror, hard, hurt, and done. Maureen hasn't spoken to her since. Not a call, not a text, not a word. And Jolene has never blamed her for it. Because somewhere deep down, in a place she doesn't let herself visit very often, Jolene knows that Maureen was right. She knows she should have stayed gone. But knowing something and being able to do it are two very different things. And the distance between them is where women like Jolene live, one day at a time, one shift at a time, one excuse at a time. So how does a Hell's Angel fit into all of this? How does a man in a leather vest with patches that make people cross the street end up in the middle of a story about a waitress and her bruises? That part starts on a Thursday night, when the rain wouldn't stop and a group of bikers needed a place to dry off. Now, about 90 miles northwest of Cedar Mill, past the county line and through a stretch of back road that most people only drive when they're lost or looking for trouble, there was a clubhouse. No sign out front. No welcome mat. Just a cinder block building at the end of a gravel lot with a row of Harley-Davidsons parked out front like warhorses resting between battles. This was the home of the Iron Vigil Motorcycle Club, a Hells Angels affiliated chapter that had been operating in that part of the South for going on 30 years. And let me be clear about something before we go any further. These were not the kind of bikers you see on reality television, cracking jokes in a garage and mugging for the camera. These were not weekend riders in matching vests who trailered their bikes to a rally and posed for photographs. The Iron Vigil were the real thing. Rough, loud, intimidating. The kind of men who walked into a room and rearranged the energy of it without saying a single word. They had a reputation, and that reputation was earned. Not all of it good, not all of it fair, but all of it real. But here's the thing about clubs like the Iron Vigil that most people never get close enough to learn. They have a code, and that code isn't decoration. It's not something stitched onto a patch for show. It's a set of rules that governs how they ride, how they fight, how they grieve, and how they treat the people under their protection. You don't betray a brother. You don't leave a man on the side of the road. And you don't, under any circumstances, turn a blind eye to someone being hurt who can't defend themselves. Especially a woman. Especially a child. Now, you can think whatever you want about men like these. A lot of people do. But that code was iron. And on a rainy Thursday night in the middle of nowhere, that code was about to collide with a waitress and a crayon drawing and a truth that an entire town had been stepping over for years. The man at the front of the pack was named Colt Brannon, 52 years old, road captain of the Iron Vigil, which meant he was the one who planned the routes, led the rides, and made the calls when things went sideways on the highway. Colt was a big man. Barrel-chested, arms like dock rope, a silver beard that hadn't seen a clean trim in months, and tattoos that started at his knuckles and didn't stop until they disappeared beneath his collar. He'd been riding since he was 19 years old. He'd done time, 2 stretches, both before he turned 30. He'd buried friends. He'd held brothers while they bled on the side of the road and waited for an ambulance that took too long. He didn't talk much, but when he did, people listened. Not because he raised his voice, because he never had to. On this particular Thursday, Colt and 5 other members of the chapter were riding back from a meeting 2 counties over when they hit a wall of rain so thick it turned the highway into a river. Construction detours had already pushed them off their usual route and into unfamiliar territory, and with visibility dropping and the asphalt turning slick, Colt made the call to pull off and wait it out. That's when they saw the sign. The Dusty Spoon, Faded letters, warm light in the window, and a parking lot big enough to fit 6 bikes without blocking the door. They pulled in, they parked, and they walked inside. The diner went quiet the way a room goes quiet when the weather changes. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. Conversations trailed off mid-sentence. Earl Dunning looked up from his eggs and didn't look back down. Hank Bellwether straightened up behind the register and put both hands flat on the counter, the way a man does when he's not sure what's about to happen but wants to be ready for it. 6 men in leather cuts, boots heavy on the tile floor, patches that told a story most people in that room couldn't read but understood instinctively. These were not regulars. These were not welcome, and every person in the Dusty Spoon knew it. Every person except Jolene. She came out from behind the counter with a pot of coffee in one hand and a stack of menus tucked under her arm, and she walked right up to that corner booth like it was any other Thursday. No hesitation, no nervous laugh, no wide eyes or tight smile. She just set the menus down, started pouring, and said, "Y'all want the meatloaf special, or you need a minute?" Like it was nothing. Like 6 Hells Angels sitting in her diner was just another Tuesday, just another table, just another group of hungry people who needed feeding. Colt noticed. He noticed because most people didn't treat him that way. Most people either stared or looked away too fast. But this woman didn't either. She just saw him, the way she saw everyone. And something in him, something old and quiet and buried deep, respected that. The meal was simple. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans from a can, and more coffee than 6 men probably needed. Jolene checked on them twice, refilled without being asked, and cleared plates without hovering. She was good at her job, and Colt could see that. But it was the 3rd time she came to the table that everything changed. She reached across to set down a plate of cornbread, and as her arm extended, her sleeve, that long sleeve she wore in the dead of summer, rode up. Just for a second. Just a few inches. But it was enough. Colt saw the bruise. Deep purple, almost black at the center, with edges that faded to a sick yellow-green. And the shape was unmistakable. It wasn't a bump against a cabinet. It wasn't a clumsy fall. Those were fingers, wrapped around her forearm like a vice. Like someone had grabbed her and squeezed until the blood vessels broke, and the pain didn't matter because the message was more important than the mark. Jolene felt his eyes. She looked down, saw what he saw, and pulled her sleeve back into place with a quickness that told its own story. The quickness of a woman who has practiced that motion 100 times, who knows exactly how fast her hand needs to move to make the truth disappear before anyone can name it. Their eyes met, just for a heartbeat, and in that half-second, something passed between them that neither one of them could have put into words. She didn't explain. He didn't ask. She picked up the empty coffee pot and walked back behind the counter, and the moment closed like a door. But it didn't lock. Colt didn't say anything that night. He paid the bill, left a $40 tip on a $30 check, and walked out into the rain with his brothers. He zipped his jacket. He threw a leg over his bike. And he sat there for a moment, engine idling, rain hammering the back of his neck, staring at the glow of that diner window. Because here's what Jolene didn't know. Colt had seen those bruises before. Not on a stranger at a roadside diner. On his own mother. On a woman named Phyllis who used to hum church hymns while she ironed shirts, and who once told a 7-year-old Colt that some people just love harder than others. He'd watched his mother hide the same marks, make the same excuses, pull down the same sleeves with the same practice speed. And he'd spent the last 30 years carrying the weight of what happened because nobody stepped in. Nobody said a word. Nobody broke the silence when it could have still made a difference. So when Colt climbed on that bike and pulled out of that gravel lot and disappeared into the dark Carolina rain, he wasn't just riding home. He was making a decision. To understand why Colt Brannon couldn't ride away from what he saw that night. Why that bruise on a stranger's arm hit him like a bullet he'd been carrying for 3 decades. You have to go back. Way back. Past the leather and the patches and the road name and the rap sheet. Past the man the world sees and into the boy the world forgot. Because Colt Brannon wasn't born hard. He was made that way. And the hands that shaped him belonged to his father. Colt grew up in a clapboard house on the outskirts of a town called Ridley, about 40 miles from the nearest place that had a stoplight. His mother, Phyllis Brannon, was a small woman with soft hands and a voice that could calm a room just by humming. She grew tomatoes in the backyard. She kept the house spotless. She read to Colt every night before bed, adventure stories, mostly, about brave men who sailed ships and climbed mountains and always came home safe. She was gentle in a way that made you believe the world might be gentle too, if you were patient enough to wait for it. His father, Dale, was not gentle. Dale Brannon was a long-haul trucker with a short fuse and a drinking habit that turned every Friday night into a roulette wheel. When he was sober, he was quiet. Not kind, just quiet, like a storm that hadn't decided whether to touch down yet. When he was drunk, the decision was already made. It started the way it always starts. Raised voices behind a closed bedroom door. A plate broken in the kitchen. A silence the next morning that was heavier than any sound. Colt was 5 the first time he saw his mother with a bruise she couldn't explain. She told him she bumped into the pantry door. He believed her. He was 5. What else was he supposed to do? But children are not stupid. They are small, and they are powerless, but they are not stupid. And by the time Colt was 8, he knew exactly what was happening in that house. He knew that the pantry door didn't leave knuckle-shaped marks. He knew that his mother's clumsiness only ever showed up on weekends, after his father came home smelling like bourbon and failure. And he knew, with the quiet, terrible certainty that only a child can carry, that he was too small to stop it. So he did what children in those houses learn to do. He made himself invisible. He stayed in his room. He pressed his pillow over his ears. And he waited for the silence that came after, which was somehow worse than the noise, because at least during the noise you knew it was still happening. The silence meant it was over, and you had to go out and pretend it never started. When Colt was 14 years old, his father came home on a Saturday night in a rage that was different from the others. Colt never found out what triggered it. It could have been anything. It could have been nothing, because men like Dale don't need a reason, they just need a target. What Colt remembers is the sound. A sound he will carry to his grave. The sound of his mother's face hitting the edge of the kitchen counter. And then a silence so total, so absolute, that for one horrible moment, he thought she was dead. She wasn't dead, but the damage was severe. A fractured orbital bone. A concussion. 2 broken fingers on her left hand where she tried to shield herself. The ambulance came. The hospital asked questions. And Phyllis Brannon, sweet, soft-spoken Phyllis who grew tomatoes and read adventure stories and hummed church hymns while she ironed, looked the doctor in the eye and said she fell. She tripped on the porch step. It was dark. She was careless. These things happen. Colt told them the truth. He stood in that fluorescent-lit hallway in his pajamas and his bare feet, and he told the nurse, and then the doctor, and then a man with a clipboard who said he was from social services that his father had done this. That his father had been doing this for years. That somebody needed to do something, please, because his mother wouldn't say it, and somebody had to. Nobody listened. Not really. They wrote things down. They made phone calls. They said words like investigation and follow-up and we'll be in touch. And then Dale Brannon talked to someone, or knew someone, or threatened someone. Colt never found out which. And the whole thing went away like smoke through a screen door. Phyllis came home. Dale came home. And life went back to exactly what it had been before, except now Colt knew something that would shape every single day of the rest of his life. He knew that telling the truth doesn't matter if nobody wants to hear it. And he knew that the systems people build to protect the vulnerable are only as strong as the people willing to use them. Phyllis Brannon passed away when Colt was 21. Not from a beating. Not directly. But from years of cortisol and fear and a nervous system that never once got the chance to rest. Her heart gave out on a Wednesday morning in November. She was 46 years old. Colt was 800 miles away, working a construction job he'd taken to put distance between himself and Ridley. He didn't make it home in time, and he never forgave himself for that. Not for being far away, he could live with that. But for every night he'd pressed that pillow over his ears. For every morning he'd walked into the kitchen and pretended he didn't see the swelling. For every single moment he had the chance to be louder, to be braver, to be bigger than a boy is supposed to be, and wasn't. That guilt became the engine of everything Colt built after. His anger, which was constant and quiet and lived just beneath the surface of every interaction. His loyalty to the Iron Vigil, because the club gave him a family that operated on a code he could trust. A code that said you show up, you stand up, and you don't look away. His deep, bone-level distrust of authority, of police, of courts, of social workers with clipboards who write things down and change nothing. And most of all, his ironclad, unshakable belief that you protect the people who can't protect themselves. Not because it's noble, not because it makes you a hero, but because the alternative, the standing by, the looking away, the pressing the pillow over your ears, is a kind of death you carry while you're still breathing. So now, let me ask you something. Remember earlier, when we said Jolene looked Colt in the eye and begged him not to help? When she said, "Please, don't, you'll make it worse"? Now you understand why that wouldn't stop him. Because Colt had heard those words before. Not from Jolene, from Phyllis. And the last time he listened, the last time he respected the plea to stay out of it, to leave it alone, to let it be. The woman who said it ended up in the ground at 46 years old with a heart that simply forgot how to keep beating. He wasn't going to listen this time. And if you believe that the people who step in, even when it's not their fight, even when it's messy and complicated and none of their business, are the ones who actually change the world, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Because this story is far from over. And the people who need to hear it most are the ones who almost scrolled past. The following Thursday, Colt rode back to Cedar Mill. He told himself it was the route, a scenic detour, nothing more, a man who liked the way the road curved through the pines just south of the county line. He told the brothers who asked that he was scouting a new corridor for a rally run the chapter was planning in the fall. And maybe part of that was true, but the part that mattered, the part he didn't say out loud, was that he couldn't stop seeing that bruise. It lived behind his eyelids now, purple and black and shaped like a hand that had no right to touch anyone that way. He'd been carrying it for a week, the way you carry a stone in your boot, constant, irritating, impossible to ignore no matter how far you walk. So he came back. He parked in the same gravel lot. He walked through the same door. He sat in the same corner booth. And when Jolene came over with the coffee pot, he ordered the same thing, black coffee, no sugar, and he tipped the same 40% he'd left the first time. He didn't say much. He didn't push. He just sat there, drank his coffee, watched the diner do what diners do, and left before the lunch rush hit. The following week, he came twice. Jolene noticed. Of course she noticed. She noticed everything. That was who she was. A woman who spent her days reading people the way a sailor reads the sky, always watching for the shift, always bracing for the change in weather. She noticed that he always came alone now, without the other five. She noticed that he always sat in the same booth, the one near the back with the torn vinyl seat and the view of the parking lot. She noticed that he never looked at his phone, never read a newspaper, never did anything to fill the silence the way most solo diners did. He just sat and watched, not her specifically, or at least, not in a way that felt predatory. It was more like he was watching the whole room, taking its temperature, cataloging its rhythms. Like a man who had learned a long time ago that the safest thing you could do in any room was understand it before it understood you. She didn't ask why he kept coming back. Jolene had learned, through years of hard and painful instruction, that asking questions was a luxury she couldn't afford. Questions led to conversations. Conversations led to connections. And connections, with men especially, led to consequences she would pay for long after the conversation ended. So she poured his coffee, cleared his cup, and kept her distance the way a deer keeps its distance from an open field. Close enough to see it, never close enough to cross it. But Colt was patient. He was patient the way only a man who has spent decades on a motorcycle can be. A man who understands that the road doesn't care about your schedule, that weather happens on its own terms, and that the fastest way to get somewhere is not always the straightest line. So he started small. He asked her how long she'd been working at the Dusty Spoon. 6 years, she said. He asked her if she liked it. She paused just a beat too long before she said yes. He asked her if she had kids, and when she said BEA's name, when her face did that thing that mothers' faces do when they talk about their children, that involuntary softening, that flicker of something bright behind all the exhaustion and the armor, something in Colt shifted. His jaw unclenched. His shoulders dropped a quarter inch. And he said, quietly, almost to himself, "My mother's name was Phyllis." He didn't say more than that. Didn't explain. Didn't elaborate. Just set the name down on the table between them like a small, fragile offering and let it sit there. Jolene looked at him for a moment. Really looked at him. Not the way she looked at customers, but the way you look at someone when you're trying to figure out if they're safe. And then she picked up the coffee pot and moved on to the next table. But she heard it. He knew she heard it. And that was enough. For now. It went on like this for almost 3 weeks. Colt would come in, sit in his booth, order his coffee, leave his tip, and exchange a few words with Jolene that were always small, but never quite casual. There was a weight to them, a deliberateness, like a man placing stones across a river one at a time, building a crossing he hoped someone might eventually trust enough to walk across. And with each visit, the distance between them shrank. Not dramatically, not in any way that anyone else in that diner would have noticed, but in the way that two people who are both carrying heavy things can sometimes recognize the weight in each other without anyone having to put it down. Then came the visit that changed everything. It was a Wednesday, unseasonably hot, even for the South, the kind of day where the air itself feels like a wet towel draped over your shoulders. Colt walked in and sat down. Jolene came over, and he saw it immediately. A scarf, wrapped around her neck, knotted at the side, in the middle of a heat wave that had half the town in tank tops and cut-off shorts. She was wearing a scarf, and beneath the edge of it, just above her collarbone where the fabric couldn't quite reach, there was a mark. Dark, fresh, the kind of mark that doesn't come from a fall or a bump or a clumsy accident in the kitchen. The kind of mark that comes from a hand closing around a throat. Colt didn't move. He didn't stand up. He didn't raise his voice. But his hand, the right one, the one wrapped around his coffee cup, tightened. Slowly, steadily, the way a fist tightens when the body is doing everything it can to keep the rage from reaching the surface. His knuckles went white. His forearm corded. And then there was a sharp, clean crack. The ceramic handle of the coffee mug snapping clean off in his grip. Coffee spilled across the table. Jolene flinched. Not at the sound, but at what she saw in his eyes. Because she recognized it. She had seen that look before, that barely contained fury, that violence sitting right behind the teeth. She had lived with it for 4 years. The only difference was that this time, it wasn't pointed at her. But she didn't know that. Not yet. All she knew was that a very large, very dangerous man was sitting in her diner with a broken cup and a look in his eyes that meant somebody was about to get hurt. And in her experience, that somebody was always her. So she leaned in, just close enough that no one else could hear, and she whispered the same words she had whispered 100 times to 100 different versions of danger. Please, don't. Colt looked at her, and for a long moment, he didn't say anything. He just set the broken handle down on the table, mopped up the coffee with a napkin, and nodded. Once, slowly, like a man making a promise he hadn't figured out how to keep yet. Now, I want to pause here, because I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking the same thing that people always think when they hear stories like this. Why didn't she just leave? Why didn't she pack a bag and take her daughter and drive away in the middle of the night and never look back? And if that's your question, if that's sitting in your mind right now like it's the most obvious thing in the world, I'd ask you to hold it, just for a moment. Because we're about to show you exactly why leaving isn't as simple as walking out a door. And once you understand that, you'll never ask that question the same way again. People talk about leaving like it's a single decision. Like one morning you wake up and you choose courage over fear, and you walk out the door and the credits roll and the audience goes home feeling good about the world. But that's not how it works. Not even close. Leaving a man like Wade Purcell isn't one decision. It's 1,000 decisions, every single one of them wired to a consequence that could destroy you. And until you understand the machinery of that trap, the gears and the levers and the walls that close in so slowly, you don't even realize you're boxed in until you try to move. You will never understand why a woman like Jolene stayed. So let me show you the cage. Start with money. Jolene worked 6 days a week at the Dusty Spoon. She earned every dollar. She poured the coffee. She wiped the counters. She smiled through the exhaustion. And at the end of each pay period, her check went directly into a bank account she couldn't access. Wade's name was on it. Only Wade's name. He set it up that way 2 years into their relationship, back when he still dressed control in the language of care. You shouldn't have to worry about bills, baby. Let me handle it. That's what I'm here for. And Jolene, who had never had a man offer to take care of anything before, who had been paying her own way since she was 17 years old, let him. By the time she realized what she'd given up, the account was his. Her name was nowhere on it. She had no savings, no credit card, no financial identity of her own. If she left with nothing. And nothing, when you have a 6-year-old daughter, is not an option. Then there was the phone. Wade tracked it. Not in a way that he tried to hide. That was part of the point. He wanted her to know. He'd text her at random hours during her shift. "Who's that truck parked outside the diner? You were supposed to be home 12 minutes ago. I see you're still at the gas station. What's taking so long?" Every ping was a reminder. Every notification was a leash. The phone wasn't a communication device. It was a surveillance system she carried in her own pocket, and putting it down wasn't an option because not answering was its own kind of crime in Wade's courtroom. Then there was the isolation. Jolene's friends, the few she'd had when she and Wade first got together, were gone. Not because they abandoned her, because Wade made it impossible for them to stay. He'd pick fights before every gathering, create a crisis that conveniently coincided with every birthday dinner and every girls' night, until Jolene just stopped making plans altogether. It was easier to cancel than to pay the price of going. And her sister, Maureen, the one person who had seen the truth, who had opened her door at 2 in the morning and let Jolene in without a word, hadn't spoken to her in 2 years. Not since Jolene drove back to Wade with B in the back seat and Maureen's face frozen in the rearview mirror. Jolene had no one, and Wade knew it, because Wade had built it that way, brick by brick, until the only person left in Jolene's world was Wade himself. But the cruelest weapon in Wade's arsenal, the one that kept Jolene pinned in place more than the money, more than the phone, more than the silence of an empty contact list, was B. Because Wade knew exactly what to say. "If you leave, I'll take her. I'll tell the court you're unfit. I'll tell them about the time you..." And here he'd bring up something small, something humiliating, something from a low moment that every human being has, but that Wade had cataloged and filed away like ammunition in a drawer. He'd twist it. He'd weaponize it. And Jolene, who had no money for a lawyer and no family to vouch for her and no documentation of a single thing Wade had ever done. Because he was careful, because men like him are always careful, believed him. She believed that if she ran, she would lose the only thing in her life that still made sense. And she was not willing to take that chance. Not with B. Never with B. Jolene wasn't passive. I need you to understand that. She wasn't sitting in that house waiting for someone to save her. She was fighting, silently, invisibly, in the only way she could. She had looked into shelters. She'd done research on the diner's ancient desktop computer during her lunch breaks, clearing the browser history every single time. The nearest shelter was 40 miles away, in a town called Briar Falls. She called once. From the diner's landline, on a Tuesday afternoon when Hank was out getting supplies and the dining room was empty. A woman answered. Jolene spoke for 4 minutes. It was the most honest she'd been with another human being in years. Wade found out. He checked the call log on the landline, not because he had a reason to, but because men like Wade are always checking something, always scanning for a crack in the wall, a sign of rebellion, evidence that his grip might be loosening. He saw the number. He looked it up. And that night, when Jolene got home, was the worst one yet. She couldn't go to work the next day. She told Hank she had the flu. She told herself it was the last time she'd ever try. But it wasn't. Because here's the thing about women like Jolene. The thing that the people who ask, why didn't she just leave, never seem to understand. She never stopped trying. She just learned to try quieter. On a shelf in the back room of the Dusty Spoon, behind a row of old cookbooks that nobody had opened in a decade, there was a paperback novel. A romance, dog-eared and sun-faded. The kind of book someone had left behind in a booth years ago and nobody had bothered to throw away. Jolene had hollowed it out, carefully, with a box cutter, late one night after closing. And inside that hollowed-out book, folded into tight little squares, was cash. $5 here, $10 there. Tips she'd pocketed before they could go into the register, coins she'd found in the parking lot, a 20 that a regular had pressed into her hand one Christmas and told her to keep for herself. She'd been building that stash for 8 months. Slowly, patiently, the way a prisoner chips at a wall with a spoon, not because they think they'll break through tomorrow, but because the act of chipping is the only thing that keeps them from losing their mind. She was almost at $400. She didn't know what it was for, exactly. She didn't have a plan, not a real one, not one with dates and destinations and a step-by-step exit strategy. But she had $400 that Wade didn't know about, hidden inside a book he'd never read, in a place he'd never think to look. And that $400 was the only thing in Jolene Whitfield's life that belonged entirely to her. What Jolene didn't know, what she couldn't have known, because she'd spent so long believing she was alone in this, was that while she was hiding $5 bills inside a paperback novel, Colt Brannon was making phone calls. And the people he was calling? They didn't play by the same rules Wade did. Now, if you've been listening to this story and building a picture in your mind of how the next part goes, I'd bet good money you're imagining something like this. Colt rounds up a few of his brothers from the Iron Vigil, rides into Cedar Mill under a black sky, pulls up to Wade Purcell's house, and delivers the kind of justice that doesn't involve courtrooms or paperwork. A knockdown door, a man dragged off a couch by his collar, a conversation conducted with fists instead of words. And honestly, part of Colt wanted that. The part of him that was still 14 years old, standing in a hospital hallway in his bare feet, begging someone to believe him about his father. That part of him wanted to put Wade Purcell through a wall and call it closure. But Colt didn't do that. And the reason he didn't is the reason this story matters. Because Colt Brannon had lived long enough and lost enough and broken enough things with his own hands to know a truth that most angry men never learn. Brute force doesn't fix this. You can beat a man like Wade Purcell into the ground, and all you've done is given him a reason to play the victim. He'll press charges. He'll call the police. He'll show up in court with a bandaged face and a lawyer and a story about how a gang of bikers attacked him for no reason. And Jolene, the woman you were trying to protect, she'll be standing in the wreckage of it with no money, no plan, and a custody battle she can't win because the man who was hurting her is now the man who got hurt. Colt had seen it happen before. Years ago, a brother in the club named Donovan had tried to handle a situation like this the direct way. Rode up to the guy's house, put him on the pavement, told him if he ever touched his wife again, he'd be eating through a straw. It felt righteous. It felt like justice. And 3 weeks later, Donovan was in county lockup. The wife had a protective order against her, not against the husband, against Donovan. And the man who'd been doing the beating was sleeping in his own bed, while the woman he'd been beating was sleeping in her car. Colt never forgot that. It was the lesson that separated him from every other angry man with good intentions and a heavy hand. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't hit someone. It's call someone. So that's what he did. He called Nadine Cobb. Nadine was 58 years old, lived in a small house with a screened-in porch 2 counties east of Cedar Mill, and wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck like a librarian from a different century. She was not a biker. She was not intimidating. She was not the kind of person you'd look at and think, that woman could change someone's life. She was a former social worker who had spent 23 years inside a system she believed in until she didn't anymore. And then she built something outside of it, a domestic violence advocacy network that operated on donations, volunteer hours, and the kind of stubborn, unshakable belief that every woman deserves a way out even when every institution around her has decided she doesn't. Nadine didn't wear leather. She wore cardigans. But she had a spine made of the same steel as any man who ever wore a patch. Colt and Nadine had history. About 7 years back, a club member's wife, a woman named Patty, had been in a situation not so different from Jolene's. Colt had gone to Nadine because someone in the club knew someone who knew her, and Nadine had done what she does. She'd built a plan. She'd found a shelter that wasn't on any public registry. She'd connected Patty with a legal aid attorney who filed the paperwork before the husband even knew she was gone. And Patty got out. Clean. Safe. With her kids. Colt never forgot that either. He never forgot that a woman in a cardigan with reading glasses did what a clubhouse full of men in leather couldn't. So he called her, and he told her about Jolene. He told her about the bruises. He told her about the scarf in the summer. He told her about the way Jolene flinched when the coffee cup broke and the way she whispered, "Please don't," like a prayer she'd memorized from saying it so many times. And Nadine listened the way only a woman who has heard this story 1,000 times can listen, without shock, without drama, with the steady, surgical calm of someone who has long since stopped being surprised by cruelty and has focused every ounce of her energy on the mechanics of escape. When Colt finished, Nadine told him what Jolene would need. Documentation first, photographs of the injuries, dates and times, any written communication that showed a pattern of abuse. Then a safety plan, a step-by-step blueprint for how to get out and where to go, designed around the specific details of Jolene's life, because no 2 exits look the same. Then legal support. A protective order, an emergency custody filing, something with teeth that would keep Wade at a distance long enough for Jolene to breathe. And finally, a place. Not just any place. A place Wade couldn't find, couldn't charm his way into, couldn't show up at with flowers and tears and a performance so convincing it made you forget what his hands had done the night before. But then Nadine told Colt something harder. Something he didn't want to hear, but needed to. She said, "Colt, you can build every piece of this. You can line up the shelter and the lawyer and the safety plan and lay it all out like a roadmap. But she has to choose to walk it. You cannot drag someone to freedom. If she doesn't make the decision herself, it won't hold. She'll go back, and it'll be worse when she does." Colt was quiet for a long time after that, because he knew Nadine was right. He knew it in his bones, in the same place where he still carried the memory of his mother choosing to go back to Dale Brannon after every hospital visit, every broken promise, every time the cycle completed itself and started again from the beginning. He knew that the hardest part of helping someone isn't building the bridge. It's waiting for them to cross it. But he also knew something else. He knew that Jolene was already trying. He'd seen it in her eyes the day the coffee cup broke. Not just fear, but calculation. The quiet, desperate math of a woman who is always measuring the distance between where she is and where she needs to be. She wasn't ready yet, but she wasn't giving up either. And that was enough for Colt to start building. If you think more people in this world should be like Colt, the kind who don't just see the problem but actually do something about it, the kind who pick up the phone instead of looking the other way, drop a comment that says, "Never look away." Seriously, because every comment pushes this story to someone who might need to hear it. And you never know whose screen it's going to land on. Here's something you need to understand about men like Wade Purcell. They don't need evidence. They don't need proof. They don't need to catch you doing anything wrong. All they need is a feeling, a shift in the air so small that a normal person wouldn't even register it. But Wade wasn't a normal person. Wade was a predator, and predators don't survive by being smart. They survive by being alert, by sensing, on some deep and primal frequency, when the thing they've been controlling starts to slip, even a fraction of an inch, out of their grip. And Jolene was slipping. She didn't know it. She hadn't done anything different, not consciously, not deliberately. She hadn't made a plan. She hadn't packed a bag. She hadn't said a single word to anyone about what Colt had said, or what the broken coffee cup had meant, or why a man with tattoos on his knuckles kept showing up at her diner and looking at her like she was a person instead of a problem. But something inside her had shifted. Something so small and so quiet that she herself couldn't have named it. Maybe it was the way she held eye contact with Wade a half-second longer than she used to. Maybe it was the way she didn't apologize fast enough when he snapped at her about dinner being late. He showed up at the diner on a Tuesday afternoon. No warning. No phone call. No text that said, "I'm coming by." He just appeared, pushed through the front door, sat down at the counter, folded his hands in front of him, and watched. He ordered a sweet tea he didn't drink. He smiled at Hank. He made small talk with Earl Dunning about the high school football team. And the entire time, his eyes were on Jolene. Not angry, not aggressive, calm. The specific, surgical calm of a man who is conducting an inspection and wants you to know it. Jolene's hands shook from the moment he sat down to the moment he left. She dropped a spoon. She forgot an order. She poured regular coffee into a decaf pot and didn't realize it until a customer flagged her down. At one point, Hank, who had been watching from behind the register with that quiet unease he never quite acted on, leaned over and said, "Everything all right, Jolene?" And before she could open her mouth, Wade answered. Smooth. Easy. Like a man brushing lint off his sleeve. "She's fine. Aren't you, sweetheart?" Jolene nodded. "Because that's what you do. You nod. You confirm the lie. You perform the version of yourself that keeps the peace for one more hour, one more day, one more shift. And you pray that it's enough." It wasn't enough. Because that same week, Wade found something. He was going through Jolene's things. Not for the first time, not even for the 10th time, but with a new intensity, a new purpose, the way a dog digs when it smells something buried. And in the pocket of Jolene's work apron, folded between a few crumpled dollar bills and a receipt from the diner's food supplier, he found a business card, plain white, black lettering, a phone number, and a name, Colt Brannon. On the back, written in block letters with a ballpoint pen, were 3 words, "When you're ready." Wade didn't know who Colt Brannon was. He didn't know about the Iron Vigil. He didn't know about the coffee cups or the corner booth or the bruise that had been seen or the silence that had followed. But he knew one thing. Colt was a man's name. And for Wade Purcell, that was enough. That was more than enough. That was gasoline on a fire that had been burning low for weeks, and now it was roaring. He tore the house apart that night. Drawers yanked open and dumped on the floor. Closets emptied. Mattress flipped. He went through her purse, her phone, her coat pockets, the glove compartment of her car, the bathroom cabinet, the space behind the dryer where lint collects and nobody ever looks. He was searching for evidence of an affair he had invented in his own mind and was now fully committed to proving. He didn't find it. He didn't find the money, either, because the money wasn't in the house. It was in a hollowed-out paperback on a shelf in the back room of the Dusty Spoon, right where Jolene had left it. But that near miss, the knowledge that Wade had been that close, that thorough, that determined, landed on Jolene like a collapsing ceiling. Because if he had gone to the diner instead of the house, if he had looked at that shelf instead of the bathroom cabinet, if he had picked up that sun-faded paperback and felt the weight of it and wondered why a romance novel was heavier than it should be, it would have been over. Everything she had been building, every $5 bill she had folded into a tiny square and pressed into the hollow of that book like a seed into soil, gone. And with it, the last thread of hope she had left. The next morning, before the diner opened, before Hank arrived, before anyone could see her, Jolene moved the book. She took it off the shelf, carried it to the supply closet at the end of the hallway, knelt down on the cold tile floor, and slid it behind a case of paper napkins on the bottom shelf, all the way against the wall, in a corner where the light didn't reach. And she knelt there for a moment, in the dark, with her hand on that book, and she breathed. Not because she felt safe, because she needed to remind herself that she was still capable of protecting something. That Friday night, Wade did something he had never done before. Jolene was in the kitchen, washing BEA's dinner plate, when she heard it, the front door closing. Then the deadbolt. Not from the inside, the way you'd lock up before bed. From the outside. The sound of a key turning in a lock that was designed to keep people out, but was now being used to keep people in. Then she heard his truck start. The engine turned over, the headlights swept across the living room curtains, and the gravel crunched as he pulled out of the driveway. And then, silence. The kind of silence that doesn't feel empty. The kind that feels full. Full of intention. Full of consequence. Full of a message that didn't need words because the lock had already said everything. Jolene stood at that kitchen sink with a wet plate in her hands and her 6-year-old daughter watching cartoons in the next room, and she understood. She had no phone. Wade had taken it with him. She had no keys. They were on the hook by the front door, on the other side of a deadbolt she couldn't reach. She had no idea where he had gone, or when he was coming back, or what he would do when he did. She was locked inside her own home. And for the first time in 4 years, the cage wasn't a metaphor. Saturday morning came, and Jolene Whitfield did not show up for her shift. The coffee sat unmade. The sign stayed on closed 10 minutes past opening. Hank Bellwether unlocked the diner himself, tied on an apron he hadn't worn in years, and called Jolene's phone. It rang and went to voicemail. He tried again. Same thing. He muttered something about the flu going around, poured himself a cup of coffee, and started cracking eggs. That was Hank. A good man with a short reach. He noticed, but he didn't act. He never did. But Gloria Vance did. Gloria was 63 years old, the diner's other waitress, a woman built like a fence post with a voice like gravel and a pair of eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She had worked at the Dusty Spoon for 11 years. Longer than Jolene, longer than most of the regulars had been coming in. And for the last several months, Gloria had been doing something that no one knew about. Not Hank, not Jolene, not a single soul in Cedar Mill. She had been talking to Colt Brannon. It started after Colt's 3rd or 4th visit. Gloria had watched him watching Jolene, and she recognized something in his attention that wasn't romantic and wasn't predatory. It was protective. So one afternoon, while Jolene was on break in the back, Gloria walked over to Colt's booth, set down a fresh cup of coffee, and said 5 words, "I see it too, honey." That was the beginning. From that day on, Gloria became the bridge between Colt's plan and Jolene's reality. She told him which days Jolene came in looking worse. She told him when Wade showed up unannounced. She told him when Jolene seemed close to breaking and when she seemed close to something else. Something harder to name, something that looked almost like resolve. Gloria never told Jolene any of this. Not because she didn't trust her, but because she knew Jolene. She knew that fear would override everything, that Jolene would shut it down to protect herself, the way she always did, and the window would close. So Gloria watched, and she waited, and she passed information to a man she barely knew because her gut told her he was the right one to have it. When Jolene didn't show up that Saturday morning, Gloria didn't call the phone. She called Colt, and Colt was on his bike within 4 minutes. He rode to Cedar Mill with 2 brothers from the chapter, not for violence, not for confrontation, but as witnesses and as a wall between whatever they found and whatever might follow. He called Nadine on the way. Nadine called Deputy Harlan Greer, a quiet, square-shouldered officer in his late 40s who was one of the only law enforcement contacts in the county that Nadine trusted with a domestic violence call. Most cops in that part of the state treated DV as a nuisance, a private matter, a he said she said, a situation best handled by telling both parties to cool down. Harlan Greer was not most cops. He'd seen what cooling down looked like when it showed up in the emergency room at 2 in the morning. He took the call seriously. Nadine and Harlan arrived at the house first. The front door was locked. From the outside, the deadbolt was turned with a key that wasn't in the lock anymore, and every window on the ground floor was latched shut. Harlan walked the perimeter. Nadine stood on the porch and knocked. Not a cop knock, not a fist on the door demand, but a steady, calm, open palm knock that said someone safe is here. From inside, the faint sound of a television. Cartoons. Then footsteps. Small ones, quick ones, a child's feet on hardwood. And then BEA's voice, high and curious, calling through the door. "Mommy, someone's here." When Harlan opened that door, legally, carefully, with the authority of a welfare check and the documentation to back it, what he found on the other side was not a woman in crisis. Not exactly. It was something more complicated than that. B was in the living room, cross-legged on the carpet, watching cartoons the way any 6-year-old watches cartoons on a Saturday morning, completely absorbed, completely unaware that anything was wrong. And Jolene was on the kitchen floor, back against the cabinets, knees drawn up, a duffel bag beside her, zipped and packed, and in her lap, held with both hands like something holy, was a sun-faded paperback romance novel that was heavier than any book that size should be. For $100. 8 months of $5 bills and spare change and secret, desperate hope folded into tight little squares and hidden inside a story about love that someone had left behind in a booth and never come back for. She had packed that bag hours ago. In the dark, in the silence after Wade's truck disappeared down the road. She had moved through the house like a ghost, pulling clothes from drawers, tucking BA's favorite blanket into the side pocket, grabbing the one photograph of her and B that she couldn't leave behind. She had done everything right. She was ready. She had made the decision that Nadine said she had to make, the one that no one could make for her. She had chosen to go, but she couldn't get out. The door was locked. The windows were latched. Her phone was gone. And so Jolene did the only thing left. She sat on that kitchen floor, held that book full of money in her lap, and waited. For Wade to come back. For the end of everything. For whatever was going to happen next. She had no way of knowing that what happened next was a knock on the door from a woman in a cardigan and a deputy who actually gave a damn. Wade Purcell pulled into his own driveway 47 minutes later, and the first thing he saw was the cruiser. Black and white, parked at an angle near the mailbox, light bar dark but unmistakable. Then Nadine's sedan, a dusty tan thing with a cracked bumper and a back seat full of file folders. And then the bikes. 3 Harley-Davidsons, lined up along the curb like a sentence no one had finished yet. Wade's truck rolled to a stop. The engine idled, and for a long, still moment, he didn't move. He just sat behind the wheel, processing the scene the way a man like Wade processes anything that threatens his control, quickly, strategically, with the part of his brain that is always calculating, always adapting, always looking for the angle that gets him out clean. Then he stepped out, and he smiled. "Officer." He said it the way he said everything in public, warm, easy, a man with nothing to hide and no reason to worry. He walked toward Deputy Greer with his hands visible and his posture open, the body language of cooperation, of confusion, of a good citizen who just wants to understand. "I don't know what's going on here, but I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. Is everything all right? Is my family okay? My family. Not Jolene. Not B. My family." The possessive was instinctive, embedded so deep in his wiring that he didn't even hear it anymore. But everyone else did. Greer didn't respond to the charm. He stood with his feet apart and his clipboard in hand and told Wade that a welfare check had been conducted, that the front door had been found locked from the outside, and that the occupants inside had been unable to leave. Wade's smile tightened. Just a fraction. Just enough. And then came the pivot, the shift from charm to victimhood, executed so smoothly it was almost seamless. Look, I don't know what she told you, but she's got problems. Anxiety. Makes things up sometimes. Ask anyone in town. I've been nothing but patient with her. I coach Little League, for God's sake. His voice cracked on that last part. Practiced. Precise. The crack of a man who wants you to think he's hurting, not dangerous. Greer still didn't bite. And Wade, sensing the ground shifting under him, went to his final move. The one that always worked, the one that had kept Jolene pinned in place for 4 years. Threats. Dressed up in legal language, wrapped in the calm, reasonable tone of a man who knows the system and isn't afraid to use it. I'll have my lawyer on the phone in 20 minutes. I'll have custody of my daughter by Monday. You're making a very big mistake here. That's when he turned and saw Colt, standing near his bike, 10 feet away, arms folded across his chest, silent. Colt hadn't said a word the entire time. Hadn't moved. Hadn't needed to. He was just there. Present. Immovable. Watching Wade the way a man watches something he has already made up his mind about. Wade looked at him. Looked at the patches. Looked at the tattoos and the silver beard and the absolute stillness in those eyes. And he said, with the kind of contempt that men like Wade use when they feel the room slipping away from them, "This has nothing to do with you." Colt looked at him for a long moment. And then he spoke. 2 words. Quiet. Final. The kind of quiet that isn't soft. It's heavy. It does now. Wade's jaw tightened. But before he could respond, Deputy Greer stepped forward and handed him a document. A temporary protective order, drafted by Nadine's legal contact, signed by a judge that morning, filed and processed before Wade even knew the wheels were turning. He was ordered to vacate the property immediately. He was prohibited from contacting Jolene or B. He was barred from coming within 500 feet of the diner, the house, or any location where Jolene might be. It was airtight. It was legal. And it was already done. Wade took the paper. He read it. And for the first time in this entire story, he had nothing to say. No charm. No tears. No legal threats. Just silence. The silence of a man whose playbook had just been taken from him. He folded the order, put it in his back pocket, and walked to his truck. He opened the door. And before he climbed in, he looked past Greer, past Colt, past Nadine, and found Jolene. She was standing in the doorway of the house, holding BEA's hand, and she was looking right back at him. And the expression on Wade's face in that moment, the last thing Jolene saw before he got in that truck and pulled away, wasn't anger. It wasn't defeat. It was a promise. The kind of promise that doesn't need words. The kind that says, very clearly, very calmly, this isn't over. And Jolene knew it. She felt it in her chest the way you feel a crack in a dam. Invisible, structural, the kind of thing that holds for now but won't hold forever. The monster was leaving. But the monster wasn't gone. If you believe that nobody should have to live in fear in their own home, share this video. Not for me. Not for the algorithm. For the person in your life who might be hiding the same bruises Jolene was. And if that's you. If you're listening to this right now and something in this story feels a little too familiar, keep watching. Because this story ends differently than you think. The shelter was 63 miles from Cedar Mill. Not the one in Briar Falls. Nadine made sure of that. The one in Briar Falls was the one Jolene had called from the diner phone 2 years ago. The one Wade had found on the call log. The one that had cost her a night she still couldn't talk about. That shelter was compromised. Wade knew about it. And in Nadine's world, a shelter a predator knows about isn't a shelter anymore. It's a destination. So Nadine reached into her network, the one she had built over 2 decades of doing the work that systems were supposed to do but didn't, and she found a different place. Smaller. Quieter. A converted farmhouse at the end of a county road that didn't show up on any public registry. Run by a woman named Ida who asked very few questions and kept a very locked gate. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't pretty. The beds were narrow and the walls were thin and the bathroom was shared between 4 families. But it was safe. And safe, when you've spent 4 years living without it, is the most beautiful word in the English language. Jolene and Bea arrived on a Saturday evening, carrying one duffel bag between them. Bea held her mother's hand, and looked around the way children look at unfamiliar places. Not with fear, exactly, but with the wide, cautious curiosity of a small person trying to decide whether this new world is a good one or a bad one. Jolene signed paperwork. She was given a room, a small one at the end of the hall with a window that looked out onto a field of wild grass. She unpacked the duffel bag. She put BEA's favorite blanket on the bed. She placed the one photograph she'd grabbed from the house. Her and B at a county fair, cotton candy, matching smiles, on the nightstand. And then she sat on the edge of that narrow bed and cried. Not the way she cried at home, silently, carefully, with one hand over her mouth so no one would hear. She cried the way a person cries when they've been holding their breath for 4 years and someone has finally told them it's okay to exhale. It was ugly and loud, and it shook her whole body. And B climbed in her lap and wrapped her small arms around her mother's neck and said, "It's okay, Mommy. We're okay." And for the first time in as long as Jolene could remember, she believed it. Meanwhile, something quieter was happening back in Cedar Mill. The Iron Vigil did not threaten Wade Purcell. They did not show up at his door. They did not corner him in a parking lot or leave a note on his windshield or do any of the things that people imagine biker clubs do when they decide someone has crossed the line. What they did was simpler than that, and in some ways, more effective. They made themselves visible. A member riding through town on a Tuesday afternoon, parking at the gas station, nodding at the cashier, buying a pack of gum, and riding out. 2 bikes parked outside the diner on a Thursday evening, their riders eating meatloaf and making conversation with Hank like they'd been coming there for years. A presence, steady, unhurried, unmistakable, that communicated a single message to anyone paying attention. We are here, and we are watching. It was the language of the road, spoken in a dialect that men like Wade understood instinctively. Not a threat, a boundary, a line drawn in gravel and engine oil that said, very clearly, you do not cross this. And Wade, for all his cruelty, for all his manipulation, for all his ability to terrorize a woman half his size behind a locked door, Wade was, at his core, a coward. That's the thing about men who hit. They choose their targets carefully. They choose people who are smaller, who are isolated, who are trapped. They don't choose people who hit back. And the Iron Vigil hit back. Wade knew it. The whole town knew it. So Wade didn't test it. He stayed away. He moved in with a buddy on the other side of the county. And for the first time in 4 years, Jolene's name wasn't followed by a flinch. The weeks that followed were not cinematic. There was no triumphant music, no slow-motion montage of a woman rebuilding her life in golden afternoon light. It was paperwork. Endless, exhausting, dehumanizing paperwork. Jolene filed for a permanent restraining order and sat in a courtroom with fluorescent lights and plastic chairs and told a judge things she had never said out loud before. Dates, details, descriptions of specific nights that she had buried so deep she wasn't sure she'd be able to find them. But she found them. Every single one. And the judge listened. The permanent order was granted. Wade was barred from contact indefinitely. Then came the custody filing. Nadine connected Jolene with a legal aid attorney, a young woman named Priya who worked out of a storefront office with a fern on the windowsill and a filing cabinet that didn't fully close. Priya wasn't flashy. She didn't give speeches. She just did the work. She filed the emergency custody petition. She gathered the documentation. The hospital records Jolene didn't know existed, the police reports from calls the neighbors had made that Wade had talked his way out of, the testimony from Deputy Greer about the locked front door and the woman and child trapped inside. The emergency custody was granted within 2 weeks. He stayed with Jolene. Full stop. No visitation. No negotiation. No loophole for Wade to thread himself through. It was over. Legally, formally, finally over. And the $400. Those crumpled 5s and 10s, and that single Christmas 20, folded into tiny squares and hidden inside a hollowed-out romance novel for 8 desperate months. Jolene spent it on B. She bought her new school supplies, a backpack with a cartoon horse on it, a set of markers with all 64 colors, a lunchbox that B picked out herself, and a winter coat. A real one, not the hand-me-down from a church donation bin that B had been wearing for 2 seasons. A proper, brand-new, bright purple winter coat with a hood that zipped all the way up and buttons that actually matched. It cost $112. Jolene stood at the register and paid for it in cash, and when the clerk asked if she wanted a bag, Jolene said no. because B was already wearing it, in the middle of September, in 60-degree weather, refusing to take it off. And Jolene let her, because $400 isn't a lot of money. But when every single dollar was earned in secret and saved in fear and protected with your body and your silence and the last shred of hope you had left, $400 is everything. And spending it on your daughter, on your terms, in a store where nobody is watching and nobody is keeping score, that is what freedom feels like when you're learning the shape of it for the first time. Then Maureen called. It had been more than 2 years since Jolene's sister had spoken to her. 2 years since that morning in the driveway, when Jolene loaded B into the car seat and drove back to Wade and watched Maureen's face harden in the rearview mirror like a door being bolted shut. Jolene hadn't tried to call. She hadn't texted. She hadn't sent a letter or driven by or done any of the things you do when you're trying to repair something broken, because Jolene understood, in the deep, unspoken way that sisters understand things about each other, that Maureen hadn't cut her off out of cruelty. She'd cut her off out of self-preservation. Because watching someone you love choose to go back to the thing that's destroying them is its own kind of violence. And Maureen had decided she couldn't survive it twice. But small towns talk. And the Cedar Mill grapevine, which had spent years whispering about Wade's charm and Jolene's clumsiness, and wasn't it a shame about the flu she kept catching, was now whispering about something else. About a locked door and a deputy and a row of motorcycles and a waitress who had finally gotten out. The story reached Maureen the way stories always reach the people who need to hear them. Late, incomplete, and just true enough to crack something open. Maureen didn't apologize. And Jolene didn't ask her to. That's not how it works between sisters who've been through something like this. There's no hallmark moment. There's no tearful confession. There's just a phone call on a Tuesday afternoon, and a voice you haven't heard in 2 years saying 5 words that rearrange the entire architecture of your future. There's a room for you. That's all she said. Not I'm sorry. Not I should have tried harder. Not come home. Just there's a room for you. And Jolene, sitting on the edge of that narrow bed in a shelter 63 miles from everything she'd ever known, with B asleep beside her in a purple winter coat she refused to take off, pressed the phone against her ear and said, "Okay." 3 months later, she and B moved in with Maureen. The room was small. The house was old. And it was the safest place Jolene had ever lived. Colt came by once. It was a Sunday afternoon in early November, about a week after Jolene and B had settled in at Maureen's. He rode up alone. No club, no brothers, no formation. Just one bike, one man, and a brown paper bag tucked under his arm. Maureen opened the door, looked him up and down, the leather, the patches, the tattoos, and said, "You must be the one." Colt nodded. Maureen stepped aside. That was all the vetting either of them needed. He gave the bag to B. Inside was a stuffed animal. A small black horse with a yarn mane and button eyes. Not store-bought, or at least not from any store that was still in business. It looked like something that had been sitting on a shelf somewhere for a long time, waiting for the right person to give it to. B grabbed it, said thank you the way 6-year-olds say thank you, fast, distracted, already in love, and ran off to show Maureen. Colt watched her go with an expression that was hard to read and easy to feel. Then he and Jolene sat on Maureen's porch. 2 rocking chairs. A cooling afternoon. The sound of B laughing somewhere inside the house. Neither of them said much for a while. They didn't need to. There's a kind of silence that exists between people who have seen each other at their most broken, not comfortable, exactly, but honest. The kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled because filling it would only make it smaller. Eventually, Jolene asked the question she'd been carrying for months. Why did you help me? Not accusatory. Not suspicious. Just why? Why me? Why this? Why did a man with no connection to my life and no obligation to my pain ride 90 miles out of his way, again and again, to sit in a diner and drink burnt coffee and build a bridge he wasn't sure anyone would cross? And Colt told her about Phyllis. He told her about the clapboard house and the tomatoes in the backyard and the adventure stories before bed. He told her about the sound of his mother's face hitting the kitchen counter and the hospital hallway and the clipboard and the silence that followed. He told her about the guilt, the 30 years of it, the weight of it, the way it shaped everything he became and everything he couldn't outrun. He told her about the bourbon and the bike and the club and the code and the night he sat in a diner in a rainstorm and saw a bruise on a stranger's arm and felt 14 years old again. He had never told this story to anyone outside the club. Not once. Not in 30 years. But he told Jolene. Because Jolene understood something that most people didn't. She understood that the scar Colt carried wasn't about violence. It was about silence. About all the people who saw and said nothing. About the systems that were supposed to protect and didn't. About a boy who told the truth and was told, in 100 quiet ways, that the truth didn't matter. Jolene listened. And when he was finished, she didn't say she was sorry. She didn't try to comfort him. She just looked at him and said, "She would have been proud of you, Colt." And something in his face, something old and locked and rusted shut, opened. Just a crack. Just enough to let the light in. They sat on that porch until the sun went down. Then Colt stood up, zipped his jacket, and walked to his bike. He didn't say goodbye. He just nodded. The same slow, deliberate nod he'd given her the day the coffee cup broke. And Jolene nodded back. And that was enough. Not a fairy tale. Not a Hollywood ending. Just two people who had seen each other at exactly the right time, in exactly the right way, and had been brave enough not to look away. Jolene didn't need a hero. She needed a witness. Someone who refused to look away when everyone else did. Colt Brannon wasn't a perfect man. He'd lived a hard life and made choices most people wouldn't understand. He'd broken laws and broken bones and spent years on the wrong side of lines that polite society draws in permanent ink. But he understood one thing that the polite, church-going, law-abiding citizens of Cedar Mill didn't. He understood that silence isn't peace. It's permission. That every time you see a bruise and accept the excuse, every time you notice the flinch and change the subject, every time you tell yourself it's not your place and turn back to your coffee and your eggs, you are not keeping the peace. You are keeping the cage locked. And the person inside it pays the price for your comfort. Gloria understood it too. A 63-year-old waitress with gravel in her voice and steel in her spine, who never made a speech, never called a hotline, never posted a single word about it on the internet. She just watched, and when watching wasn't enough, she picked up the phone and called the one person she believed would do something about it. That was her revolution. Quiet. Invisible. And it changed everything. And Nadine understood it. A woman in a cardigan with reading glasses on a chain, who had left a system that failed the people it was designed to protect and built something outside of it with her own two hands. She didn't wait for permission. She didn't wait for funding. She just did the work. Year after year, woman after woman, one hollowed-out book at a time. And eventually, Maureen understood it too. A sister who had closed the door because she couldn't bear to watch it happen again. And then opened it, 2 years later, with 5 words that didn't include an apology because they didn't need one. There's a room for you. That was enough. That was everything. It wasn't one person who saved Jolene. It was a chain, link by link, hand by hand, decision by decision, a chain of people who looked at the silence around them and decided, one by one, that looking away was no longer something they could live with. He still has that stuffed horse. The little black one with the yarn mane and the button eyes that Colt brought in a brown paper bag on a Sunday afternoon in November. She named it Thunder. She sleeps with it every night. She doesn't know the full story yet. She's too young, and some stories need to wait until a person is strong enough to carry them. But one day, when she's older, Jolene will tell her. She'll tell her about the diner and the rainstorm and the man who saw what nobody else would look at. And B will hold that little black horse and understand that sometimes the people the world is afraid of are the very ones who show up when no one else will. There's a diner in Cedar Mill called the Dusty Spoon. The coffee is still burnt. The pie is still fresh. The bell above the door still rings that same tired little note it's been ringing since 1970-something. And behind the counter, 6 days a week, there's a woman pouring coffee. Her hair is pulled back in a ponytail that's still always slightly coming undone. She still remembers that Earl Dunning likes his eggs over medium. She still knows the Presley twins need 2 cherries or there'll be a war. But something is different now. The sleeves are rolled up. The bruises are gone. And the smile. That smile she used to rebuild from scratch every single morning like a wall between herself and the world. She doesn't rehearse it anymore. It's just there. Quiet. Easy. Real. The smile of a woman who is no longer hiding. If this story moved you, if you believe the world needs more people like Colt and Gloria and Nadine, then do one thing. Subscribe to this channel. Not because I'm asking, but because every time you do, the algorithm shows this story to someone new. And maybe, just maybe, It reaches the person who needs to hear it most. If you've ever known someone like Jolene, or if you've been someone like Jolene, drop a comment. You don't have to say much. Just let us know you're here. Because you're not alone. And you never were.